Hello. Welcome to Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. This month, we're reading Wolf Riders, the second anthology of short stories set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. There are 8 tales of grim and perilous adventure, including the second Gotrek and Felix story by William King, a Drachenfels prequel, sort of, by Kim Newman writing as Jack Yeovil, and a noir-inspired detective story set in the old world's greatest port city, Marienburg. There are a bunch of fun and interesting stories here. My friend Stu and I will be delving into each of these stories in turn, but before every one, I will provide a bit of a précis of the events therein, starting with Wolf Riders by William King. Our old friend Felix Jaeger finds himself in trouble, getting into a bar fight in defense of a pretty young woman's dignity. The timely intervention of dwarf trollslayer Gotrek ensures that Felix comes through things just fine, and then gives him a chance to befriend the damsel, Kirsten. After discovering that she is part of a caravan, Felix convinces Gotrek to join up, and the two defend the wagons from skeletons and gobos. And all the while, Felix and Kirsten become closer. After settling in an abandoned fort in the Border Princes, the people of the caravan, followers of an ousted baron, are forced to defend themselves against an enormous greenskin horde. Whilst Gotrek becomes an engine of destruction, Felix discovers that the would-be Baron has slaughtered many of his own followers, including Kirsten, due to some kind of chaos-induced madness, a self-fulfilling fear of chaotic curses. Devastated by his loss, Felix recommits to his oath, and now both Gotrek and Felix set out in search of some form of redemption. So, Stu, we'll start with Wolf Riders by William King. What did you think of this, the second Gotrek and Felix story?
You can guess what I'm going to say with this one, can't you? It's I'm a bit of a fan of Gotrek and Felix, and this was a story I'm very, very familiar with, having read it to my son, having read it years and years ago, quite a few times, and then recently listened to the audiobook, and I've also listened to the podcast as well. So I had it read by other people. I love the story. Been fond of it years. So it's something. It's probably the only story so far I probably didn't need to read on that. You're going to test me on it now, but I like it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. I think we talk about the Warhammer-ishness of some of these stories quite often, and it feels, spoiler, probably the most Warhammer of those stories in this book. Or at least that style of Warhammer that's still recognizable within Warhammer today, whereas some of the other themes have probably been aged out of the canon and maybe over the years. But I just like it. I think you see the development between the two cases. I think it's the first story in Troll Slayer. I think it's in that order. But it's still early days in their relationship, and you're seeing the development of their sort of the way they react with each other, and Felix's guilt. You see him falling for girls, which he does throughout the series in many different times, and you see his kind of the guilt between wanting to stay with the troll slayer, but also that kind of, is this it now? Can I not go off and do my own thing? But I love it. I love the themes. You see goblins in it. You see Warhammery things, and you get some nice kind of interesting interplays with the Von Deals and the idea of the hidden curse and secrets and the Border Princes. Lots of stuff I love about Warhammer.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about, because it feels like William King is one of the authors so far in GW books who is the most steeped in what I would consider to be the sort of Warhammer world, the sort of more recognizable one, as you say. And he really finds ways to bring that to life. And that might be throwaway references. It might be the way certain characters interact. Even the fact that, like you say, there are goblins in this, which we don't seem to see for some reason in many of these stories. There is a dwarf in this, which we also don't seem to see. So you're getting these different aspects of the Warhammer world in the characters and the protagonists and the villains and stuff like that. But then the story itself does feel very close to Warhammer Fantasy roleplay again. So in the first story, Geheimnisnacht, which was very much an adventure for a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay party, it felt like. This one feels like the backstory for a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay PC in Felix's tale. And it's not the most complex story, and there's maybe some elements that haven't aged that well, which we can come to, just in terms of tropes and stuff like that and devices within storytelling. But as a story itself, as the second story about these characters, Gotrek the Troll Slayer and Felix, his human friend who's made an oath to follow him, this really did feel like it expanded their sort of story and gave me, who this is the first time I'm reading these stories, it gave me like way more of a sort of depth to the characters, and it was effective in saying, okay, let's find out more about Felix now. And I hope that the third story, which we'll get in the next anthology, does a little bit more on the Gotrek side as well, and gives us more of his backstory, and continues that tale. So very effective kind of Empire Strikes Back middle story out of 3, it felt like to me.
Yeah, I suppose it could work that way. I haven't thought of it that way, because I still find it hard to separate these stories from Troll Slayer as a book, because that was the first time I experienced them. And then you go on that, while they're all short stories, it does also feel chronological, so to speak. And even the second book, and this is going off topic a little bit, even the second book, while they are short stories, it feels like one whole narrative brought together into short stories. It's not till they sort of move on to later books that they become singular novels, so to speak. So I still see it within the context of their overall story, rather than it kind of being a 3-part spread over some compilation books like this one. But I think, again, as we're comparing it to other stories in this book, the Warhammerness from it, he seems to be, he gets dwarves, he gets Empire humans maybe better than some of the other stories do. They're definitely recognizable, I would say, as the Empire was in 8th edition, but also that Warhammer Fantasy roleplay Empire, it fits either way. Nothing seems too far out of kilter. But there are goblins in it that are recognizable as goblins, and he seems to get chaos the way you would see it on the tabletop, which, again, if you've come from this from a war gamer's perspective, you expect to see it in that way. And I just think that works, and it's instantly recognizable, and it's the kind of thing that a young Warhammer player, which is what these were aimed at, would want to see. And
yeah,
and then you chuck in a girl, and and a bit of sadness and a bit of grimness at times and things as well. And
absolutely.
And a good guy that's turns out to be a bad guy, or is he? Or is he just? And you still got that interplay with chaos a little bit. Is he just twisted? Did he mean to be bad, or is he evil? And at the end, you think, yeah, he's a bit of a. But was he always that way? Or does he just feel forced into that? And you've still got those underlying kind of. Should I feel sorry for people that have been tainted by chaos? And I still think that there is an element there of yes, you should. It's not, they haven't all chosen that. It's weakness, or they've been tricked, etc., etc. And I like that. I think it's good.
Yeah, there's definitely that, because chaos as this kind of insidious force underneath the surface within the Empire is the classic Warhammer Fantasy roleplay version of chaos, because obviously there's mighty armies of chaos marching around, but in those kinds of stories, it's something that just bubbles away and corrupts and corrodes from within, and that's what we see here. And we've seen that in some of the other William King stories as well. But seeing this sort of would-be baron who has discovered that his father was fully mutated by chaos, and his own like retainer had kept him in the tower and kept him sealed away so that no one would see this mutation, and then that has caused the young Manfred von Deal to kill him and sort of take on this mantle of leading his people, and they've been ousted from their lands as a result of all of this sort of upheaval. But then he is still, even though he's sort of doing the right thing for his people, he's still found himself corrupted by chaos, but maybe not physically in the same way that his father had been, sort of more in like his and so that has just corrupted his mind and led him to think this curse is something that's going to lead to the destruction of these people. So he's going to enact it and sort of bring the curse to life. And that's a really super dark version of chaos, I think, that can destroy almost. For Manfred von Deal, it's almost destroyed him without doing anything. He sort of thought himself into a corner where he's ended up destroying everything, which is bleak, to say the word. But
yeah.
It definitely works in this sort of story, and I think there's also some fun like red herrings through the tale as well, because we're introduced to Frau Winter, who is a magic user who so Kirsten is the sort of the damsel in distress that Felix and really Gotrek save at the start of the story, and who Felix starts to have this relationship with. She works for Frau Winter, and Frau Winter is spends most of the tale sort of as a sort of figure who could be doing some dodgy stuff. And there's an interaction with sort of skeletal sort of graveyard, a magical boundary, this kind of place where no one should enter because there's some sort of magical seals in place. Overnight, that gets broken, and the caravan get attacked by skeletons. And it sort of feels like, oh, maybe this was her doing. Maybe Frau Winter did this. But she's a very effective red herring for actually she's totally straight down the line, doing her best, uses her magic to try and save the people, and really it's the noble baron or would-be baron who is actually the guy who's been corrupted.
It's not quite a twist, is it? It's kind of, you kind of probably know that that's where it's going to go, or something like that, or there's more to it. It would be too simple if it was just her. But yes, it is enough kind of different potential arcs that leave you guessing, and you're not quite sure about it. And you know that at least one of the followers of the Von Deal train that's going off towards the Border Princes, you know that at least one of them's probably not right, and it's about how far deep that evil goes, I suppose, isn't it? And it's a tragedy at the end, that so many of the ones that you think, well, maybe they're a bit bad, and they don't make it to the end, I suppose, in some ways. But I mean, it's quite brutal. Even that scene with really the skeletons, brutal, we've got orphaned children crying by their dead parents' bodies and things, and there's little sort of quite visceral details which that would be implied now in a Warhammer story, probably, rather than described, maybe. Yeah, I quite, there's a lot of interesting, likable characters that you can imagine being in other stories, and I suppose some of them are in some ways, or at least talked about. But it's I love it.
Yeah, that's the fight scene with the skeletons was really intense as well. I thought, like, really well done, very edge of your seat sort of stuff. There's not a load of action in it, but just the setting, the way that the danger had sort of been seeded earlier on.
That's touched upon, rather than just kind of, well, everyone fights as normal. It's even your heroes are scared and having to fight past fear to be able to sort of just swing a sword. So that's all in there.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And it really feels, again, like having the wolf riders themselves and the goblins in there, having skeletons come to life and fight. That's a really fun sort of fantasy thing. It really embraces this fantasy world and gives you, okay, here's some magic stuff, and it's scary, and it's given a sort of tangibility that's really good. Same with the use of magic. So when Frau Winter defends the fort towards the end of the story, she's using this magic lightning to attack the goblins who are sort of attacking all these greenskins who are attacking the fort. And it's really given a weight. It feels powerful. And I quite liked that, because there's always this difficulty in the sort of distinction, like how magic is treated in Warhammer Fantasy roleplay versus Warhammer Fantasy battle. Because in the roleplay game, much lower level, magic is much sort of rarer and kind of a lower fantasy world through that sort of lens. In fantasy battle, magic is super powerful. And it makes sense, because obviously your greatest wizards are marching to war to defend the world or to conquer it. So you can sort of square that circle of why it's different. But the sort of reverence for that power of magic that Gotrek and Felix both seem to have in this story makes it feel like, you don't see this sort of stuff every day, but there is a time and a place for it to be used.
Battle magic, or almost being seen for the first time from people that weren't really exposed to it. Gotrek probably fought in lots of battles. Dwarves not really known for their magic, or maybe in this era they were actually. But and then Gotrek's never been in the Felix has never been in the military, has he? So he's probably not seen those things. He's only heard of those things. So that kind of magic that would almost fit into Harry Potter in the sort of practical daily basis kind of things, to big fireballs and electric shots and things like that is different. And it's good. It reads very well, and it's quite dramatic, isn't it?
What did you make then of the So the death of Kirsten. So Manfred von Deal, in enacting this chaos curse, killed everybody pretty much, including Kirsten, who Felix has now fallen in love with, thought he was going to retire and leave Gotrek behind for this woman. She's killed in that, and then it sort of galvanizes Felix to continue his quest. Like, what were your thoughts on that as a device?
I mean, I think it's done as the device for the future of Gotrek and Felix as a duo, really. So I think it's powerful when you don't have a happy ending in things. And it was, I think Warhammer leads to not always having a happy ending, having a slightly kind of okay, the hero doesn't always fully win, and they win, but there's severe costs to their winning. Physically, and the friends and people that they've lost, and obviously Gotrek loses an eye. So there's lots goes on here. So yeah, I think I'm not surprised that she was killed. I don't think I was surprised. Was I surprised the first time I read it? Too long ago now to remember, but I'm not surprised. And I think that it was almost a way of saying, look, this is it now. That almost cements their duo. That the kind of the lost eye. Gotrek completely battered, really barely survives the battle, and then Felix's heart probably doesn't survive the battle and the journey, and it's almost like that's what hardens them as a duo, and then they go on and have lots of other adventures. But it's quite a grim. It's almost like a western when they're like a train going out to the unknown Midwest, and they're attacked by natives or something, isn't it? The amount of times they're put in danger, they go to different towns and things. So it almost feels like a western where by the end of it, it's a bit of a tragedy, and the two gunslingers go off their own way because what they kind of joined on to was practically destroyed by the end. I think there's only a few left, isn't there? And they hopefully, I think it says a bit of a throwaway line, but there's so few of them now. They hope they'll be taken in by another small town in the Border Princess. But yeah, I think it was very much, we're going to kill her so that Felix can't have a relationship. He's going to have to his man wife, which is, or dwarf wife, is Gotrek, and will be for the time being.
And
what about you? What did you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, just on that general point about it, the sort of Western feel, yeah, I totally agree. And it really does have that kind of vibe. And the Border Prince is painted as this kind of Wild West, feels like what they were going for with that aspect of the setting as well. So it really works for that, I think. The stuff with Kirsten, I think, it as a device, it does work, and it gets you exactly to where you're saying. You do get to this place where Felix now has realized the sort of happy life isn't going to be possible. He's bound to Gotrek, and he's bound to this oath and this sort of quest for redemption. So it definitely works to get them together and sort of explain why Felix, who in the previous story maybe wasn't quite as committed to Gotrek. He was there because he'd made the oath, but he was complaining about it to himself, and he didn't really seem like he wanted to be there, which I guess will be a continuing theme anyway. But at least now the resolve makes more sense, I think.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, is that this is very much of that sort of trope, and you see it quite a lot of it's described in comic books as the fridging of the female character, the girlfriend character who exists purely to get killed and then to give sort of man pain to the hero and cause the hero to want to get his revenge and go off and do whatever. And it's been used again and again and again. It was, terrible in comics for it, just lousy with it through the 90s and earlier as well. And it still, unfortunately, does happen. So I think it would have been better to get a little bit more of Kirsten and sort of understand more about her. She doesn't really exist as a character. We see more of Frau Winter, really, as a character than of her. All we know is how Felix feels about her. I don't even think we get a strong sense of her affection for him, to be honest.
Well, you don't. Yeah, he might just be. I think there is an element of his character that he's young and he's inexperienced, and maybe he's thinking with the wrong parts of his body and misunderstanding misinterpreting his feelings and what they really mean.
Yeah,
And
I can completely
as a
believe that. Yeah,
man in my mid-40s now, I can remember being in my early 20s, which is what I think, I assume that Felix is supposed to be at that age, sort of thing. And yeah, you definitely think in a different way. And
sure.
I think as the stories progress, and again, this is a risk of talking about future Gotrek and Felix stories, and that might be a lovely discussion one day, just to sort of talk about how the characters develop. But there are quite a lot more female characters, and they're not all throwaway kind of eye candy for Felix. There's some pretty strong female characters later in the series that stick around for a lot longer, and they do play on his romantic sort of feelings and his feelings of love and wanting to settle down. So that's still there. So that those are used again, but it's I think more here it was to move to define those characters. So yeah, probably in the way you said, but it doesn't quite set them up for that's it now. He's grim for life, and he's never touches, he ignores women, he loses his heart. He's still the same guy, but he just gets a little bit sadder and a bit grimmer as he progresses through the future stories. So I don't think it doesn't turn him into this kind of grim noir hero. It's his character of quite liking the ladies remains.
And I'm probably being
I'm not sure that's
bit...
a good thing either in some ways, but it's I think it was more a device to cement their relationship and say, right, well, he can't disappear off. This duo staying together.
Yeah,
and I think that was it, more than to set him up as a grim kind of heartbroken person. There's elements of that in the later stories, but there's also a lot to suggest that he does get over it as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'm probably being a little bit too harsh as well. I'm obviously looking with modern sensibilities back at something written, in 1989. So yeah, it's probably not that fair to call it out and and leave it there. It works within the context of the story. It would have been his children
who were killed now, wouldn't it? They would.
But like, it does. I think I'm just calling it out as it's a bit of a shame. I think I would have liked more in that, but it does work and it doesn't undermine the story for me. I still really enjoyed this, and I think this was probably, I going into Wolf Riders the collection. This was a strong start, much like Ignorant Armies, starting with a William King, Gotrek and Felix story, incredibly strong opener, and definitely filled me with a lot of excitement for what's to come. Actually, before we move on to what's to come, there's a couple of neat little bits of trivia that William King sticks into this story that I should mention. One is a name drop of Detlef Serk from Drachenfels, which I loved. I thought that was great. Lovely little bit of connective tissue to that. And then the other one was that Von Deal, so the Manfred Von Deal, the sort of heir to the baronet, he is related to Kurt Von Deal, who was the protagonist in Laughter of the Dark Gods, which was the second William King story from Ignorant Armies, who was a brother who was forced out of his inheritance, and he had gone into the Chaos Wastes in order to get enough power to come back and claim what he thought was his birthright. So it's a great little twist, I think, in the sense that, again, you're seeing chaos, the effects that chaos can have on one family, an extended family, and how, okay, well, this guy is just completely mutated and turns into a monster, and then this son has to go out into the Chaos Wastes to seek power and glory so that he can become strong enough to claim what he thinks he wants. And then the other brother is out there doing the quote-unquote right thing, which ultimately ends up in him sort of succumbing to chaos in a completely different way. And I think that's a very, I want to say fun, which is probably not the right sentence to use the word, but it's a very interesting, I guess, exploration of chaos and how it can affect people.
I agree completely. It's lovely little tidbits, and even we haven't talked about a lot. Felix is an educated man who writes, and so he's already got that connection with playwrights and that kind of society. So the characters talk, don't they? Oh, you're a writer too, and I'm working on a play, and that's all in there as well. So that the connections with Detlef works really well as well.
It does, it does. And I think actually one of the members of the Patreon discussion that we had about Wolf Riders just to explore all the themes and the various points of it. So Ryan just mentioned that his sort of summary of this as a story was that this is really where Felix ceases to be the sidekick of Gotrek and becomes the sort of co-protagonist. And I think that's a
I
really
agree,
good
yeah.
way of looking at it as a story, because that's very much what this feels like it's doing. It's moving Felix from just a tag-along character who's there to narrate stuff for us, and the real stories about the dwarf, to now going into the next stories, I would hope.
Yes.
Actually, it's these are both the main character of this tale.
Absolutely.
And it's Gotrek and Felix now.
Is exactly it. And as the character grows, if you read more, you'll see that it takes a little bit longer for him to realize that. But as a reader, we notice that and we realize that.
Great.
And that's an interesting sort of exploration itself.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're not doing a
There's time for that in the future.
book series.
Yeah. The Tylean Rat by Sandy Mitchell. Halfling private investigator Buttermere Sam Warble is retained by a red-haired elf in search of a small rat statue that was stolen from her lodgings. As Sam follows the trail of the missing MacGuffin across the seedy streets of fog-bound Marienburg, it quickly becomes clear that the statue and the people who want it are not quite what they seem. But even the spectre of chaos cults, underworld contacts, dark elf femme fatales, and a good old-fashioned twist in the tale won't stop Sam from completing his case. So this one, set in Marienburg, the tale of a private detective. What were your thoughts on the Tylean Rat?
I did enjoy this. It amused me first. So I should say that I didn't manage to get hold of a copy of the book. So I've listened to all of these twice from the wonderful voice of Lewis on the Oldhammer podcast. And I've deliberately not listened to any of his summations at the end because I didn't want my own thoughts sort of coloured by it. So I'm looking forward to going back and listen to him because he always amuses me. So I've listened to everything twice, and the first time just listened to it normally, the second time making some notes as I went along. So I really liked it. I think my initial notes were this is Samwise Gamgee meets Columbo. Didn't quite make it into a Poirot kind of character. He's not sophisticated enough. So it's more of I imagined him more of a Columbo kind of character. I thought he was unusual. I think the initial descriptions of Marienburg are lovely, really kind of give you a feel for Marienburg as a city and the way it works, and the fog and the mists coming in and things. So I thought that was done very, very well. So I think it was well written. There's no surprise with Sandy Mitchell's gone on to write quite a bit more for Black Library in the future. And I thought that the overall tale was absolutely fine. For a short story, I think it worked nicely. I thought it was amusing in places. I thought it was pace enough, and length seemed to be fine as well. Yeah, I just thought it was fine, really. I wasn't blown away by it, and I can look at it and fondly and go, oh, that was a relatively amusing story. And I probably would like to see more of Sam Warble again, because there's enough about him, enough of his character that's amusing. Maybe you'd always feel like that about a halfling character, but it was good. There's some characters in it. There's so many kind of detective story type tropes in there that I wasn't offended by. I thought they were quite good. So you've got the guard chief who, if you think of an American private investigator, they always have a contact in the local police force that they get some behind the scenes information on. Sometimes it's a little bit fractious, that relationship between them. That's in there with the chief watchman. And you've got Lisette as well, who's clearly sort of linked to the criminal underworld, and that happens as well in all of these PI things. So he's got his police connection, but he'll always have his semi-friendly connection to the mafia or something. It'll occasionally give him a tip off or get some extra information. It's exactly what you get from these. So I think that this could have been written by Jim Butcher. It's and I like that because I love his books and things. So I liked all of that. And would be really interested to see a full-length novel with these characters developed properly, or really got a crunchy story all set in Marienburg, and those characters really pushed out a little bit more. We've got fairly recognizable chaosy stuff in there as well. I think it's It's from a different side. So you've got a witch elf with, you know, Cain worshipper. I think Slanesh worshipper, maybe for Erasmus and his little snotling. But I liked it. It was good. It was a nice, fun story. Made me chuckle at a few places, and very recognizable, as I said, as some kind of US-based private investigator.
Yeah, I mean, it's fully leaning into noirish fiction. It's the Maltese Falcon, but what if we stuck it in to the old world instead, right? And yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's a really fun idea, and taking all of those tropes, just grabs them all and finds a way to make them work in this setting. You know, even down to the femme fatale, except yeah, she's a witch elf, and there's this dark sort of evil stuff going on. I enjoyed it. I really had a good time just spending some hours, well, within the story, spending this time in Marienburg, wandering around, going to see contacts, trying to sort of follow the leads. I think Sam was a really fun character, and just like playing up that what if a halfling was a private detective thing. It works surprisingly well. And I agree. I'd love to see more stories. I mean, there is another Sam Warble story to come, which is fantastic. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too.
I had been looking forward to this story a lot because obviously I'm super into Marienburg at the moment. I've been super inspired by it. So knowing that there was going to be a story like this in this set, very high hopes. And for the most part, it lived up to it for me. So I had a really good time reading it. I enjoyed it. And I still enjoy it, but I do think that it's let down a little bit by its ending. And I think this becomes a theme in the rest of this series of stories, unfortunately. But for this one, it was a little bit of a shame. And yeah, maybe this is sort of ties into noirish tropes as well. But it felt like Sam didn't really do anything in the final act of the story. He turns up, he follows the right people to the right places, and he witnesses this battle between both of his antagonists. And then not only does Lisette, the sort of underworld contact, turn up, but she turns up and explains everything that Sam didn't know, and then says, oh, and by the way, the City Watch guy that you're also friends with, he's going to turn up and clean up the mess. So the antagonists defeat each other, and then both of his contacts turn up to explain all of the mystery and then sort of save the day. And it's not the end of the world, but it just felt like a bit of a sudden, a bit too passive an ending for Sam. He wasn't responsible for solving anything. And I think that's a bit of a shame for me.
He's almost like he needs some muscle. He needs a sidekick that can
potentially
help him out in the areas where he physically can't intervene, because it got to the point in the story where it would be ridiculous if he was somehow able to outfight.
But then that's what I
think
think
big bads.
In a really strong version of this ending, him using his wits to have outsmarted people, or to, you know, keep them delayed long enough for the City Watch. He
should have prearranged for those other people to be there like in an ambush.
Yeah. You know, the Columbo just one more thing kind of moment where Sam proves why he's good. Because the sense I get from the story is that Sam is well regarded as a detective, but then the actual events of the story, he gets outsmarted left and right. He gets found. People keep finding him wherever he goes. He gets conned with the fake gold, which he just passes on to his own contacts without even interrogating it. And sort of, you know, so all of this stuff happens where he kind of bumbles a little bit too much. And again, I can let it go because it's just a fun short story.
It's just a short story, yeah.
But I would have loved if he'd come good by the end of it and had actually succeeded at something.
Well, I suppose you could have had this, that he goes to meet them and the city guard are there and they arrest them, and he's challenged, well, how did you know? And then he does the stereotypical end of a PI type thing where he tells how, you know, well, you told me this,
he's worked.
I realized you were wrong, and
Yeah.
explains how he got to the bottoms,
Exactly.
rather than it being told to us earlier on. That he doesn't find out, and he goes to meet them, and then they get arrested, and he explains how he knew what they were up to. And that would have been, well, you would have finished the trope off then, wouldn't you? It would have become an Agatha Christie, maybe.
But maybe it was the point of the story was that he's actually not the best detective, and it's an absurd idea in the first place. but it didn't quite feel like it went far enough to make a sort of parody of those things.
Yeah.
It felt like it was leaning into it in the sort of homage kind of sense rather than the sort of parody sense. So
Yes, yeah.
for
So
me,
maybe they didn't want to make it too parody.
yeah, it
It's
just didn't quite stick the landing, I think. But like I say, I really enjoyed it. There were some really fun details in there as well. Like I said, Marienburg is a really nicely drawn location for this. There's some cool character stuff. There is the Snotling Associate that is just a very odd choice, but fantastic. I love it. And
a
it's such a
clean snotling. He's been described at one point.
yeah. It just is a really good when you put him next to this huge hulking, almost kingpin style bulk of a man that is the chaos sort
Yes.
of worshipping villain. Like just to have a tiny little snotling is also it's his pal. That's such a fun idea. I'm really behind that.
Yeah, I liked it. I'm really looking forward to the next Sam Warble story and see
Yeah,
whether he's just hapless and bumbles along in that one as well. He's not completely hapless, but
he's not
he's
happy,
definitely
but
unremarkable.
yeah,
He just
but
knows
yeah.
some people, doesn't he? That's it. That seems to be his ability to be a private investigator. He knows people.
And I look forward to the next one. I know he also turns up in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as a sort of character archetype as well. I think it's a shame that seems to be almost the sum total of his appearances because I think it's a fun character. I could imagine loads of stories with this guy.
Yeah, maybe they just didn't know what to do with it because maybe he can't. Maybe he's not used to the fighting style of stuff. Maybe he's far better suited to, I don't know, track down a copy of Fly Fishing by J.R. Hartley rather than rather than deal with Daughters of Cain. Maybe that's it. Maybe they run to the end of the road with it. Be nice to see him turn up in other things. I'd love to see him turn up in a Gotrek and Felix novel, which I don't think he does, but I did enjoy it. It was as a short, and that's it. Every time I thought, well, this is a little bit, and I have to remind myself that this is a short story. This is a standalone, as at the time, written short story as well. Or it's not like it's a short in the middle of the vast Horus Heresy series where that short is an important narrative for the wider story. These don't really have much of an impact on anything other than what you're reading.
Yeah, just the flavor of the world, a little vignette to expand the Warhammer Fantasy universe. The Phantom of Remy by Brian Craig. A high-class cat burglar has been targeting the upper-class Bretonnian city of Remy, committing seemingly impossible yet trivial thefts of small keepsakes and other unimportant items. The town's most famous judge, Voltigeur, a well-regarded man of the law who delights the people with his perfectly inventive punishments, directly inspired by the crimes committed, has indirectly become the target of this phantom. He hires armed guards and has his oldest friend and clerk, Malchance, keep watch outside his bedchamber. Still, the Phantom manages to gain access and taunts the judge, but with no evidence of the encounter, even Malchance must question the judge's story. Voltigeur is indignant and fires his once great friend, braving the next night alone. But who should reveal themselves as the Phantom but Malchance, seeking revenge for the treatment of a woman he loved but who married the judge. Malchance has framed Voltigeur and kills him in a fashion that suggests self-infliction, ensuring that his name will live on in infamy, the perfect punishment. So the Phantom of Remy, it's a sort of like a heist cat burglar story, but it's also a story of revenge and a curious tale of a Bretonnian city. I mean, what were your thoughts on this one, Stu? How do you feel about this?
I thought it was very Brian Craig kind of. I think it was quite nicely written, but again, it feels like he's just having some fun within a few thousand words. Really, it's hard. I didn't dislike it. It's one of those listen once or read once and think, okay, and he's got a few enjoyable parts to it. There's a nice little twist in it, which isn't telegraphed too far out. I don't think you can start to guess, but it's not one of those. It's not so obvious that you realise.
I think I challenge you on that one myself.
Okay,
but we can get there.
But yeah, I thought it was amusing. There's some interesting names in it. I mean, I don't know. Having listened to it, Monsieur Voltigeur is, that's just a French skirmisher from as far as I'm concerned as a Napoleonics fan. There's some interesting bits we talked about. Some of the punishments that he dished out were amusing. I like the some of them are just also just a little bit odd, like the coat of prickly fur to the sort of, can't remember what that was. It's like, really, is that the best you could think of? And I'm talking about the author here rather than the magistrate's punishment, but I can't remember what that was for, but yeah, we're going to punish you by giving you a coat of, it's a bit Monty Python-esque. It's like, the comfy chair or the soft cushion. And then some of them are really, really gruesome as well. So there's lots of little amusing things like that all the way through it. And again, that sort of leads me to think that he's not being particularly serious with the story writing, and using these short stories as a bit of a tool to have fun and tell them almost like a child's tale in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I know what you mean. It's kind of broadly drawn in certain ways, and it is someone having fun and just telling a story they fancy telling, it seems like, and it doesn't seem too bothered with saying, let's learn more about the Warhammer world. It's kind of just, I've got a bit of a fable or a bit of a sort of story of karmic punishment that I'm going to tell.
It's a fable. It's
and it sort of plays out, and kind of, I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed this sort of story of it. There's certain allusions to other, kind of draws on a few other things, even being like the Phantom, there's kind of this sort of Phantom of the Opera, even sort of element of that. And because it leans into the sort of Frenchness of Britannia in certain ways, it brings out a bit of that sort of stuff. I liked this idea of a cat burglar and this kind of, the idea of impossible crimes that are happening seemed really fun as a sort of setup. I kind of thought we were going to get a bit of a Jonathan Creek kind of reveal at the end where you find out how this was all done, which as a setup, I was really excited about, because like I say, I enjoyed reading the story. So when we got to the sort of end, I was like, okay, here we go now. How is Brian Craig sort of established? He's set up all of this stuff that's happened. Now he's going to explain it, and it's going to be a real wow moment of whether it's magic or whether it's really clever plotting and planning. But it's kind of hand waved a bit at the end, so you don't get like a sort of clever reveal. You just get the judge's friend, his old friend, who I think had kind of been a pretty obvious sort of villain from, it can only be one of the two of them, and the story's is going to be more of a sort of interesting, well, I guess it could have been a more interesting reveal if it was the judge, I suppose, but it's Malchance, his clerk, his old friend. They're love rivals, but the woman that Malchance loved had married the judge instead, and then the judge didn't treat her well, as far as Malchance says. So he's then set about enacting this perfect punishment of his own, just like the judge does. But then there was no, like, it wasn't a clever reveal. And I know I've said reveal 20 times, but it just didn't feel like it delivered on that promise to me. And that's a shame, I think.
I agree. I think there's a few problems with that. I don't think it made, aside from the magistrate's unusual punishments, they're not always described to be extra harsh either. Some of them are just, feels like a man that's kind of amusing himself, but you don't get the impression beyond that he's particularly horrible. He didn't spend enough time building up any animosity that Monchamp would feel for him. So that, again, that's like, you could have spent a little bit longer setting the scene there, making him out to be a bad person. Because I was left at the end thinking that, Voltigeur is probably a bit of a, but then Monchamp also a conniving, jealous, driven mad almost. His reactions aren't a suitable, like the jealousy for a widow as well. The wife is long dead as well. Still feel you need to enact this kind of level of revenge because she chose someone else. It's not even exactly that he was tricked out of this. And I don't think that they built that at the beginning. I don't think you built up Voltigeur to be bad enough to feel like he deserved this. Yes, he's not the best man in the
I
world, but
completely
he's
agree.
not evil either.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, we
he's
don't,
definitely not evil within that kind of setting.
exactly. And what we don't get is any kind of, there's no abuse of power. I mean, you could say, well, some of his punishments are cruel and unusual, but they seem to be for guilty people. And they seem to be, everyone agrees that this is a great judge because of these kinds of punishments he comes up with. So within the laws and morals of this Bretonian place, he seems to be on the sort of right side of things. And then we've got Malchance, who's kind of like has grown to hate him or despise him over time because of this love rivalry. But all we're told about that is that the woman that Malchance loved chose Voltigeur of her own volition, and we're never told that Voltigeur did anything bad to her. They had 5 kids or whatever it was, and she lived presumably a happy life because he was very wealthy, which is what she wanted, it seems. So there's probably a really interesting story there of actually, well, what happens to someone who feels that level of jealousy, which then turns to hating this old friend, which then maybe turns to, being seduced by chaos and using chaos to do all of these kind of crazy crimes and enact this crazy punishment. Well, actually, we don't get any of that. We just get Malchance thinks he's right, and he gets away with it. And he didn't even use chaos or magic, really. He sort of
really, no. It's all
he
downplayed.
just kind of did it somehow.
Which kind of doesn't really explain how he got away with some of it. Because the things he was doing in that room would have made quite a bit of noise. I mean, how did he force the hinges off a locked box
and
at the end of someone's bed? I mean,
he explains it, and he just says, and that's how he literally is just like, I came in quickly, and then that's how I was able to get in the room quickly. It's like, this doesn't really explain this at all. So I feel like there was a missed opportunity to either, and I know I'm sort of saying I want this, and I'm not judging a story based on what the story is, but it feels like it walks up to the precipice of being this very cool sort of Jonathan Creekian style mystery, or an exploration of what chaos can allow you to do if you are this kind of jealous person. And instead, it's neither of those. It just sort of ends. And it kind of starts to cement, like with Italian Rat, it starts to cement this unfortunate trend in the rest of these stories of just going, and then it ended.
That'll do, because it's a short story. You know, what more do you... And considering Craig's kind of penchant for Slanesh, he could have very easily worked that into the solution for the way Monchon was behaving, and it would have been fitted perfectly into it and made a huge difference to the story, and as well as making it more Warhammer.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, it definitely didn't quite deliver what I wanted. Tommy in the Patreon discussion described it as having a sort of Poe-esque quality, an Edgar Allan Poe sort of mystery story. And I think there's a certain amount of that. There's a certain amount of nice writing in it, and I did enjoy reading it. So I don't want to say I didn't like the story overall. It just feels like it sort of racked up too many missed opportunities for me to be a real success as a story.
You could have. There's not many other characters in it, and when they are in it, they're kind of so much on the periphery. I'm not sure they were needed. I'm not sure you needed the wizard that was there to help him protect the home.
I quite liked that wizard, actually, because
I made me laugh because all he shouted was alarm all the time.
Yes,
after things have happened, it's almost a bit like he should have been an extra in a lower low. You imagine that kind of, the flashing knobs. It's just or Dan's Army or something. I just got this impression of this elderly wizard that's half with it, that was kind of waking up as things had already happened. I don't think it was supposed to be comedy, but it made me chuckle. But
I think that did work, because that again reminded me of like a role-playing game scenario where you'd have that kind of character who turns up. So I'm all for that sort of oddness.
It was the only magic in it, really, though, wasn't it?
Exactly.
It was almost a way of making it Warhammer and not 15th, 16th century France.
Which and I don't want to say that there's no space to tell a story that doesn't have magic and doesn't have chaos and is just a sort of simpler, lower level story within the Warhammer world. I absolutely think that there is space for that. It just has to be really good. If you're going to do that, if you're going to choose to do that in this world where you've got so many tools that you could pick up and use, and you choose not to, then you better be delivering something that's really special, I would say.
Yeah, I think that point, but as an overall editorial piece about a whole book of short stories, if they're all doing that, as we'll come on to,
Sure.
That's where it's noticeable more, because there's nothing wrong with having a story that's very low fantasy within a collection of others that show other areas of the world, but they seem to show very familiar areas of the same parts of the world that don't really seem to be the main part of the world that we're all playing in and wargaming in, I think, and that's why it's all so strange.
Yeah, and whilst we're on that, there's an interesting point here just around, like you said, about Brian Craig sort of has his particular favorites, Slanesh, and he likes to set stories in Bretonnia. We do see a few stories or that reference Bretonian characters or locations or a set there. And it is interesting how that, for a long time, wouldn't really be a focus for Warhammer as a game, either roleplay or battle game. So it's interesting that, I mean, maybe the brief sort of was people saying, well, I'm going to go and explore somewhere that I'm not treading on any toes. But then we've seen from like what William King is writing that it's totally possible to be right in the heart of certain corners of the old world and tell really good stories that draw on things that are happening without treading on any toes and actually just enhancing everything else. So it does feel like, why did so many of these authors choose, or were told, or however it came about, go off and say, well, I'm actually going to set this story somewhere where it's not going to bother anyone and add nothing?
I think it's just down to knowledge and really getting the universe that they're writing in. And if you're writing in you've got a copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and you can imagine medieval France, it's a lot easier than kind of doing the extra research or really getting into and having to invent more, because you don't have to invent much when you're just writing from that historical perspective.
That's true.
That's why it all seems to be that, or Germany, doesn't it? Which is fine. I don't mind that. I quite like those parts of the old world, but it's, if you're writing from a perspective of not really knowing those worlds as well as some other people, you can get away with it.
Yeah, it's a fair point. One other device that I think is an interesting one of note with Brian Craig stories, at least, is they seem to start, a lot of his shorts start as there's a storyteller telling a tale, and this is the story that they tell. And there was a good discussion that we had in the live chat where it was like, is this the story or one of the stories that Orfeo tells? So the minstrel character from Brian Craig's trilogy of stories, he is a storyteller. We're told he goes around and he tells stories all over the world. Both Brian Craig shorts in this collection start with a storyteller telling a story. Never explicitly says it's Orfeo or really even hints that it is, but it could be. And that, I think, is a nice
if it did
idea.
Say that it was.
I think it would have been nice, if it instead of a storyteller tells this story, if it's Orfeo sits you down to tell you one of the tales of whatever.
Quite like that.
Would have been quite cool, yeah. But then that does open the door, unfortunately, to the fact that, at least I personally think, the stories that were alluded to in the Orfeo book in Zaragoza, where it says Orfeo told this really cool story about knights on quests with magical items and curses and all this sort of stuff, sounded really fascinating. And then there's a couple of others like that sound really interesting. Why did Brian Craig not tell those stories? Like, they sound like they'd be really fun Warhammer tales. So I don't know why he's chosen to tell this one, and there's another story coming up, when he could have told another like Orfeo related story that would have been more fun, perhaps.
I suppose one is just a description of what the story may be about.
Yeah.
and isn't a story, it's just a couple of lines describing a story, whereas this actually means you've got to write the story, and it's a lot easier to do that when you've only read the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And
yeah, I guess as well, you're right. It's easier to just say, and then Orfeo told a story that was amazing, than actually write the amazing story that Orfeo told.
It was epic. You heard Lord of the Rings well. This is
Cry of the Beast by Ralph T. Castle. Thomas lives with his halfling guardian Brody in a beach hut somewhere in Estalia. At night, there are sometimes weird sounds, but Brody insists it's nothing. One night, a half-drowned, stricken elf maiden washes ashore, and Thomas feels the fires of attraction for this new guest. In the night, the elf is drawn to an illusion of her lost brother before being dragged away by a hideous monster. Before Thomas can pursue the beast, Brody finally tells him the story of his father, an innocent man whose wife was taken by chaos, and who became consumed by vengeance, a quest that cost him his life. Despite Brody's warnings, Thomas tries to save the elf, but he is too late, discovering only her remains. A great fight with the Chaos Beast ensues, this champion of chaos only just bested by Thomas thanks to a handy dash of luck. And then Thomas finds a necklace that reveals the truth of this beast. It was his father all along, or at least what his father had become. Cry of the Beast, this was the only story written by one Ralph T. Castle. As far as I can tell, the only story written by Ralph T. Castle of any type in any book ever. So this person only wrote one short story for GW books. So whether or not it was a pseudonym or not, I don't know. Might have just been someone who submitted a story or what have you. But this one, I'm going to tip my hand very early. There's something about this story that really frustrated me. And I didn't, it just didn't come together for me, this one. And I think because it's so simplistic and also so full of like contrivance and convenience in the sort of storytelling space, that it's just not satisfying at all. I mean, how did you find Cry of the Beast?
I agree. It's not very well written at all. It feels like the kind of thing I don't write. It feels like the kind of thing, at least story that I might come up with is not. It's not the most in depth. It's so much wrong with it, to be honest. The names make no sense whatsoever. Isn't it supposed to be set in Talia? We've got Thomas Brody the halfling. It's this. There's lots that don't make any sense about it. Even the name of Thomas's father, which we learn about later in the story, is Richard Crowell, isn't it? Something like that. I mean, the famous Italian-esque name. It feels, I wouldn't call it lazy. It just feels very fan fiction-esque. And there's not a lot to it. It's very linear. You can kind of guess what's going to happen. Points. And it has some, it has some promise at the beginning. It's the noise outside that Thomas wakes to, and it's a haunting noise, and he's told not to go. So it builds something that could be a horror, and maybe it's the kind of thing that would play better as a late night horror short somewhere, sort of like. And maybe that's what it is. What's that series of US horror shorts called? Mind blank now. Bum, 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 bum. No, I'm not going to remember it, so we'll move on. But it feels like the kind of thing that I would have watched on telly as a half an hour program as a teenager.
Sure, like an Outer Limits or a Twilight Zone or
Twilight Zone. That's what I was thinking of. So it feels like that kind of level of story that would have been on at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night when I was a kid or something. But yeah, it's that kind of level. It almost, you could see how that as an outline for a story would work better as something on the screen rather than as a piece of writing where you've got more space to actually, describe more, go a little bit more into the characters. It's very hard to sort of really talk about it because it's all so just plain and straightforward, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a bit.
There's not much depth to anything.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It feels, and I don't want, again, I don't think it was lazy. It feels maybe it might have been a bit rushed, perhaps, or didn't have, the additional drafts and the sort of tightening up of a story that you might want. I mean, theoretically, this tale of a young boy who's been raised by a halfling who encounters this elf maiden whose ship has been shipwrecked, and there's then a chaos beast that's pursuing them, and there's also this tied-in story of the young boy's origins and how his father has been sort of lost to chaos, but has returned now, unknowingly, sort of, is watching over him as a chaos creature now. So there's kind of okay, that could be a cool story, I guess, if written in an interesting way. But I don't
Could
feel like
be.
it comes together.
It feels like the backstory for an RPG character that a
Oh
teenager might
yes,
come up with. You
yeah,
know, I'm a 15-year-old lad. I want to I'll make him 18 because obviously I'm looking forward to when I'm 18 and I want to be a bigger man. I like halflings. They're funny. I was raised by a halfling and quite like an elf to come and visit me, you know, and there is that element of it as well, isn't there? When he's attracted to Lena. And it just, again, it feels like a backstory that someone might write for their warrior human
yeah.
RPG character
It
rather
does,
than a
and
short
I
story.
think not the only story in this collection that has a similar. The sort of ending is, and now the big quest begins. So this is like the prelude to a good story. So
Yeah,
this is a half baked, if you want to use that sort of cruel language, half baked backstory to the really interesting tale. But you're not going to get the interesting tale because we're focusing on this bit, and
yeah,
there's not enough here outside of those sort of sketchy this happened and this happened and this happened kind of bullet points. There isn't enough meat to sort of on these bones to make it really worthwhile. The Brody character, the halfling, I quite liked. Everyone loves a good halfling. I think Brody, I wonder if that's a reference to the character from Jaws, maybe. We're at the
yeah,
seaside, sort of this town. There's a certain amount of that "don't go in the water" kind of vibe to him. So that was my read on why he's got that name. But there's not really much more of like the Chief Brody character in this. And then Thomas is a total blank slate. There's nothing to him at
yeah,
all. Same with Lena, really, the elf. And
yeah,
then the actual reveal on the sort of twist on the Chaos Monster. Oh, actually, the Chaos Monster is your father, and we know this because he's got the same Dawnstone that Brody's just given you and just told you about. Well, first of all, like structurally, we only find out the truth of the lost father character like a few lines, a paragraph or two
yeah.
before the reveal. It feels like. So it's not like it's this long held mystery that we then have a satisfying conclusion to. It's just a sudden, oh, and by the way, this is the case. And then there's also a real lack of sort of interrogation of what it means that this Chaos Monster, which has somehow found its way all the way from the Chaos Wastes to here to be close to his son, but still want to kill him, it seems,
Yeah.
but doesn't
There's
just
no dialogue
storm.
there. You
Well,
could have
no,
you
and
could have gone to town on
there's so much stuff you could
Luke,
have
I
done
am
for
your
sure.
father. Could have,
But yeah, so this Chaos Beast is right there, lives in a cave right next to Thomas. For no reason, it doesn't just storm through the shack and kill Brody
yeah,
and kill Thomas any night. If it's out there making noises every night, it could just come and kill them. But it doesn't, and there must be a reason for that. And it doesn't. We don't explore that, and we also don't get any kind of moral sort of exploration of, well, the father lost his wife to chaos and then vowed vengeance, and that revenge cost him his life as well because he then became chaos, didn't get to raise his son, didn't get to see what he became. He sacrificed everything and ended up a chaos monster, a sort of father in the shadows chaos monster. And then the son makes exactly the same vow of revenge. I've
yeah,
lost my father to chaos now, so I'm going to get revenge. And Brody doesn't go, but that's what your dad did, and he lost everything. Brody's just like, I'll get my axe, or whatever he says. It
yeah,
kind of ends on this triumphant, now the quest begins kind of thing, when actually the real ending here should be, this is a terrible damnation that you are walking towards.
yeah, 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 yeah. And it wasn't that long before in the story that Brody was saying, we can't win this.
Yeah.
We need to get away now. Let's get in the boat. We
And
will
just go.
sail
Yeah.
miles away. But it makes you wonder why didn't you do that when he was a baby, when he first came back? Why be so close? You know, I always knew he'd come back looking for us one day. Why did we stay here for? This place you want to take us now safely. You could have brought me up there. You said it was nicer weather. You said it was better. We could have moved. And it's kind of like, oh, I really shouldn't have stayed here. It's like, I really shouldn't have. It doesn't make And it's like, I really shouldn't have bought this house next to that nuclear reactor that split 20 years ago. Now all my hair's falling out. It's got, we should move away now. All my hair's gone, and now yours is going. It's got, it's odd. It's odd. Yeah.
The Oldhammer fiction podcast that you mentioned before, Lewis on that did a little bit of analysis after reading the story, and I completely agree with it. He talks about the fact that Lena, the elf maiden, she has lost her brother. She thinks her brother might be alive. So there's been a shipwreck. She and her brother were both lost at sea. She's made her way to the shack with Thomas and Brody, but she's like desperate to find her brother, and that then leads her into the arms of the monster. But the brother is given a bit more backstory. He's like an alcoholic, gambling elf kind of like rogue character. Sounds super interesting. And he's not in the story at all. So he's just introduced as a concept of a really interesting character who you're never going to get to meet and has no bearing on anything.
In any of the characters that are actually
exactly.
in the story.
That's what Lewis says. I want to spend time with that character, and we don't get to. We have to spend time with Thomas, the boring guy. And I completely agree. It's an odd choice.
It's odd, isn't it? It is odd. Like you say, like you're saying, it kind of feels like he's like he's put the manuscript in and gone, that's it. They're going to ask for a full novel on the back of this one, on the story. It's going to be like we got Gotrek and Felix. Well, we're going to have Thomas and Brody, and it's going to be brilliant. And
what a different world it would be if there were 20
volumes. Get that phone call.
No, he didn't.
Ralph T. Castle did not get that phone call. He changed his name to Roy and went and filmed Record Breakers or whatever. But another 80s reference for you in this. It's probably the worst actually out of all of them. In many, there's some of them have been questionable. I've had more redeeming factors, but there's not a lot to really kind of like in a redeeming sense. I think it's a really harsh thing to say, but it's lacking in so many ways. And some of the things you could have done to improve you wrote it. Some of the things that could have been done to improve it were relatively simple as well.
Yeah, and
I'd say.
So this one for me ties for the worst slot, and the reason I don't know that I think this one is the worst is because it's mercifully short. So it wasn't as long as my other, lowest ranked story, which we'll come to in time. We'll get to it. But yeah, I didn't enjoy this. I thought it was just too frustrating a story for me because it didn't deliver on any of its promise. I think there's some cool ideas. Brody's a cool enough character. Slanesh Chaos Monstrosities, that's cool. There's just not enough to make it work for me.
Yeah, agreed.
No Gold in the Grey Mountains by Jack Yeovil. Brigands hold up the carriage of a young girl, kidnap her and take refuge overnight in the abandoned Castle Drachenfels. Abroad in the dark, there is a dangerous old lady, a withered vampiric hag that begins cutting the brigands down one by one, entering their minds, dismembering their bodies and drinking their blood. By morning, all of the highwaymen are dead, and the young girl and old hag are revealed to be one and the same. This witchy woman is a psychic manifestation of the girl, who is in reality a vampire of unknowable age. No Gold in the Grey Mountains. So this is the Jack Yeovil story. So Kim Newman writing as Jack Yeovil. This is our sort of prequel to Drachenfels. Yes. So we're getting places and characters, in some cases, that we've seen before in Drachenfels. What were your thoughts on this as a story?
I really like this. It's very simple. We talked about, if we can compare with the last story as a very short, relatively short, simple horror story, this does it right. And everything happens fairly quickly, gets on with it, and people die. And at the end, you've guessed what's going on earlier on, but at the end, you look at this character, this incredibly old vampire that's also a little girl that you recognize if you've read other stories, and think that was good. It was nice. It was enjoyable. It's gruesome in places. I quite like some of the characters as well. So, but it works. I think it was a bit of a lesson in how you can write a short horror story and it work, and you build the suspense, and you can imagine it again. You can imagine this as a better short TV program rather than one of the more shocking ones. But yeah, I liked it a lot.
Yeah, because I think if Drachenfels was something like an Interview with the Vampire meets Shakespeare in Love meets, I don't know, Game of Thrones, this is Interview with the Vampire meets Alien.
Yes,
and meets American Horror Story, maybe. So it very much, it is short, it is sweet in its sort of delivery, very efficient. It's just pure slasher kind of horror.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, a huge triumph. I love this. This was the best story in this collection for me. It was everything I wanted from a prequel to what so far has been my favorite of the stories, the Drachenfels book. We return to Drachenfels, the place, but we don't spoil the character. He's still as menacing and looming a figure as ever, even though he's not in this at all. But he is in it because this is a place of evil, and we're going to see some evil here. And that evil is drawn in such an interesting, fun way to have this creature, this sort of hag, vampire, whatever it is, wandering around, just wreaking vengeance on these brigands who have kidnapped the young girl in quite inventive and dark ways. Very much a horror movie. You can see that Kim Newman horror movie stuff coming through. Very powerful stuff. Some really fun, inventive moments. But again, like in Drachenfels, I thought all the characters were given enough character, for want of a better word. They actually have their own motivations. They have their own interests and their own hates and desires and wants and all that sort of stuff. There is friction amongst them, and it makes sense. And we're given the sort of internal monologues of them all, so we understand what their position is on all these different things that are going on. And that's the best kind of horror film. A lot of sort of horror stories, I think, get it wrong because they're too willing to create a load of characters who are two-dimensional, who are just names, who can be in a room to get killed, and that's it. What Kim Newman does here is give you characters who are characters, proper characters, who you can then sort of either you like or you dislike, or you want them to die or you want them to live. You know, actually, the main character, Joe Lamprecht, I wanted him to make it through by the end. He's a bad guy. Throughout the whole story, we're told he's a bad guy. Everything he's done is bad. He's kidnapped this 13-year-old girl, this noble girl, because he wants to ransom her off. He's been leading these guys, outlaws, for however long. But I still wanted him to win because he's very capable, he's quite calm, and he's doing bad stuff, but he's like impressively doing that bad stuff, if that makes sense. It reminded me a bit of, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but in No Country for Old Men, where you've got a character who's doing the right things. He's doing everything you should do in this situation, and you want him to win. I felt. And that's, I think, a real win for a very short story. He really got me on side. I wanted him to make it through the night.
It's hard to put you listening to you talk about the caring about the characters, and in terms of words spoken about them and describing them, there's not a lot there. And if you compare it to the previous story, maybe even less words in some ways, and less backstory that we learn about the previous characters, but it's done in just the right amount that you learn what you need to know about those characters. And you know enough to get a picture of the dynamic between the four of them, and who does what, and who do you feel sorry for. Do you feel sorry for the younger lad, or do you feel sorry for the half-wit, the lumbering? I mean, they're tropes, aren't they? But but it works, and maybe it's because they are tropes, but they're tropes in a very clever way. So you don't need to write too much about them for us to go, I recognize who that character would be in a million other programs or books or things I've seen. So you find them instantly recognizable as the kind of characters would be in those situations. And yes, they're rogues, but that's the thing, isn't it? They're not very nice people, but in this setting, you can like a rogue, and it's not a nice world as it is anyway. And some people just do what they have to, and you feel that within their own little sphere of influence, that they're just getting on with what they know best. And I think they're in trouble. There's something sinister early on, so you start worrying for them. I mean, she's delightfully disconcerting right from the first moment when they've opened the carriage door and she's like, "Hello," it's kind of, hang on a minute. It's just, I think it just shows the quality of the writing compared to some other things that in I don't know how many words difference, but you're able to deliver all of that. And you can imagine it as a film, can't you? You can imagine it as a short story. I can imagine it on the screen, I suppose, and that's very similar. I suppose we said that when we talked through Drachenfels, that the initial scene, it felt like a film, and again, this feels like the beginning of a horror film.
It does.
It's set in those kind of periods. It's great, really good.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it really did, like I say, bring to life, or had that sort of feel of Alien to me.
Yeah,
this unstoppable horror that's stalking these corridors, and these guys are just going to try and do their best for as long as they can to survive. I mean, you've got Rotwang, who, incredible name, who's just a bit of a scumbag, and he's kind of out for himself. And you've then got these other characters, and they all sort of interact in really fun ways and interesting ways. And yeah, it is really tropey. It's very much drawing from all of the tropes you'd see in any kind of classic horror film of this type. But it does it really well, and it does it interestingly. And then there's some really, really good scenes as well. So when, I think it's Grotscheel, the youngest of the brigands.
Grotschell, is it?
Grotschell, yeah. His mind is totally broken by this sort of vampiric force, and he just runs off into the dark corridors of Castle Drachenfels, which we already know, because we've read Drachenfels. We know how dangerous and scary that is. And then Lamprecht goes after him. He doesn't even know why he's doing it, and that's great. He's like, I didn't think I cared this much about this guy, but maybe I do, or maybe I don't, and I've been, my mind has been corrupted by this force. So he goes out into the darkness, and then there's just a really good scene that you can totally visualize. He comes to the end of the corridor, he finds the young highwayman just right there, and then he sort of turns around and reveals that actually he's been totally taken over and is possessed, and they then have a very well-written fight in the darkness. And actually Joe gets injured and only just survives, and then he's stumbling back through the darkness, and he ends up having to fight Rotwang as well, who's then turned into a werewolf through this sort of dark powers. And it just, the fight scenes really work for me. They're just so well written, and the each wound that Joe seems to take just again and again and again is just really feeling it. And then there's also a really nicely done sort of Chekhov's gun of the introduction of the spur that Joe has left on his boots from when they rode in. And he slices his hand on it earlier in the story when he puts his boot on in a rush. He's like, oh, I need to remember to take that off. And then that comes in handy later on because he's now fighting a werewolf. So that's just nicely deployed. It works really well.
And again, that's another, I keep using it as a comparison, but that wouldn't have been done in some of the other stories. No. He'd have just gone, oh, by the way, I happen to have this silver dagger.
Yeah.
And it would have been a lot more in your face. And like, oh, okay, this was cleverly done. And you achieve the same thing with the same amount of words as well. But it's smart storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then, of course, the reveal at the end that the vampire, this whatever creature it was, is actually some sort of magical manifestation of the girl. They're one and the same thing. And she's just been tormenting these guys for fun because she wanted to have some fun.
Do you think she's the young girl vampire we meet in the convent or not?
Yeah, so I did go back and double check just to make sure it all lines up. And yeah, it is. So
that was my assumption.
Lady Melissa D'Arc, or however you pronounce it. So it is the same granny vampire for the vampire Genevieve. There's a slight, I think there maybe is a tweak to the character. She doesn't feel quite the same because she's a lot more of a sort of grandmother kind of character in
She's
the
almost
convent.
retired there, aren't they, in the convent? That's where they go
and
to
maybe it's 10 or 20. I think it probably would be something like 10 or 20 years later. So you could, maybe she mellowed out and this was her final hurrah, as it were.
She's also, not totally dead, is she? She's one of the
she's not.
Similar style to
they're not truly dead. I think they talk about it, But so it does make sense. It works. There's enough continuity there for it to play well. And that's your sort of prequel element, or is really a middle quel, whatever that term would be, because it takes place after the prologue to Drachenfels, but before the meat of the Drachenfels book. And this is what she was up to before she went to the convent and spent 20 years with Genevieve. So it works really, really nicely. It's a fun. That's why I like it as a prequel, because I think the best prequels tell you something else about the world without sort of spending a load of time saying, let's find out where Drachenfels got his helmet from, and like all of these details you don't need to spend a whole story on. This is actually something that adds some flavor to the world instead of just regurgitating the same stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So yes, I am very much looking forward to more Kim Newman, Jack Yeovil stories.
Yeah.
We've thankfully got a few more in the Genevieve series, and we've also got some of his Dark Future stuff as well. So I'm really super excited. As much as I've enjoyed the Gotrek and Felix and the William King stories, Kim Newman's work is definitely my MVP of GW books so far. Absolutely adore it. We'll definitely be reading some of his other work as well in the future, because it's just fantastic.
Agreed. Definitely. We need them.
They're definitely bringing up the average from the overall series for sure. Yeah. The Hammer of the Stars by Pete Garrett. A caravan of barbarian travellers arrive at the city of Wurtbad. If allowed, they would join the festivities in the upcoming festival of Tal and Ulrich. The barbarians, though looked down upon by the people of the city, put on a triumphant show in honour of their god, and they are invited to dine with the great and the good. They take this opportunity to drug the people of Wurtbad and descend into the ruined hallways beneath it in search of the runes that would point the way to the Hammer of the Stars, a great artifact of power that they would use in their fight against chaos, but which currently powers the defences of Wurtbad. Only a handful of young would-be heroes stand in their way. Hammer of the Stars, Pete Garrett's short story. This one, I think it's got some interesting ideas, but I question some of its execution. Where did you fall on Hammer of the Stars?
It was back down to earth, wasn't it? I didn't enjoy this very much at all. With you, very different to the previous one we didn't like very much. This wasn't necessarily badly written in some ways, but I didn't really like the idea of the story at all. Really, it wasn't very interesting. I'm not really sure that it handled any of it maybe the way that it was intended. It's very hard to. I was thinking about this one today. I'm thinking, what am I going to say about it? I just find that it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, we don't know much. The barbarian travelers are, I don't know who they are or where they really can't imagine where they come from in the setting. So it seems a little bit vague. And there's lots of, I don't know if the main characters, the kids don't really have enough depth to them. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was a little bit lost with, there's a lot of why.
My issue with this one is that it feels to me like it sort of glides past the most interesting aspect of its own story. So we've got these barbarians who turn up at a sort of traditional city in, I'm not sure if it was the Empire, if it was Bretonia. Wurtbad, I think is the city, right?
I think it's I imagine
sounds
Empire.
Sounds Empire,
like that,
right? So they turn up at this Empire city, And there's a real sort of class divide, I think. So you get
Mm.
the people of the city looking down on these sort of traveling barbarians and sort of they don't want to let them in. They don't like them. There's a lot of sort of class warfare going on here. And then ultimately, by the time you get to the end of the story, you find out that these barbarians have come to steal a magical artifact that the city has and the city uses to defend itself.
Yeah.
They want to use it, the barbarians, to fight chaos. And their point is you are being selfish, keeping this magical weapon for yourselves, when we would take it to the front lines to try and fight chaos and save everybody. And
Yeah.
I think that that is a very interesting story because you've got the reveal on the fact that the barbarians, the travelers, who everyone's looking down on, are actually the selfless people. We thought they were there to steal precious stuff for themselves from these noble city dwellers, when actually the noble city dwellers are just hoarding protection for themselves.
Yeah.
And the barbarians are the true heroes. And I think that that is a very interesting setup, could be a really interesting story. But this version of this story just wants to say, and that's why the barbarians are bad, because they're thieves. They break the law, and laws are automatically good because they're laws. And that's kind of not an interesting story, I don't think.
No, I don't. Exactly. What you described would have been a good story, and it doesn't tell that story. You
No,
don't
it's
really
in
find that
there
information.
super briefly, but it's just not explored.
No, it's not. And you could tell that story without the characters. I think the two the young characters of well, I can't even pronounce. So this is where I've written names down from hearing them, but it's Peridua, I think his name.
And Saskia
And
Whiteflower, yeah.
Saskia Whiteflower, what awful, strange sort of name. And their characters seem to be a little bit mixed up as well. About one lost his father, who was a knight. She's an orphan, but they're both in fairly wealthy families. So it feels like you've kind of mixed what would be a backstory about one character and maybe spread it across the two of them. Whereas normally you'd have one in a more traditional family sense. And in that, it feels like they spend too much time telling that. It just wasn't really needed in some ways. And I think it would have been better telling the story from the perspective of the leaders of the town and the chief of the guard or something like that, to be able to tell the story about the politics around should they let them have this.
Yeah.
Maybe if they'd asked for it in the first place, or been asked, we would like to use this to help protect you, and then when they were turned down, then it was the subterfuge and the trying stealing it. I'm not sure that the kids being part of the tale
kids,
and they kind of saved the day, but not save the day at the end anyway. It's all a bit of a wet ending, wasn't it, really? I mean, he's a Dawnstone as well. We didn't mention that, wasn't it a Dawnstone that Brody had that he gave to again, is that I'm not going to reach my Warhammer roleplay, but is Dawnstone one of the magical items in Warhammer Fantasy roleplay by chance? Because
there's the Doomstones, the sort of the second big campaign they did. I mean, Dawnstone, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it feels very like it would be a magical item floating around, right? But yeah, I think this has PCs from someone's role-playing group in it, and I think that's part of the reason why the backstories feel so muddy, is again because they're a bit like, okay, well, my character is an orphan, and that's why they're going to go on all the adventures, and they're both very smart and the top of their class, but also they're one of the best squires and would-be knights, and so like they've just taken every single box for the wish fulfillment of the reader, I guess, because they're going to go off on a quest. And this is the other one I was talking about when I mentioned for the end of Cry of the Beast, when it's the least interesting part of a story as a prelude to a more interesting epic adventure. And we never get the epic adventure. We just get the boring start because we have we end this story with Peridot and Saskia and brother Martin, who's sort of a wiser character, stood ready to take on the quest to find the Hammer of the Stars. Come back next week and you're going to see our heroes on their adventure, but they never do go on that adventure. And
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
You're right when you say that these characters, they didn't really need to be in this story. The reason they are in this story is because they get to foil the bad guys, and the reason they foil the bad guys is they sort of out talk them. They sort of prove that they were wrong, so the bad guys just leave. It just sort of doesn't really work.
Feels like an early scene in a Dungeons and Dragons movie, or maybe, and then leads on to I mean, with the name like Saskia Whiteflower as well. That's D&D. That was not even Warhammer. And in terms of it's I didn't enjoy it very much.
Yeah, it like I say, I think there's an interesting kernel of a story that could have been really interesting if that's what this story was about, and it's not.
No.
Instead, it's about the sort of the young, presumably teenaged reader of the book. What if they were the only person who knew what was really going on in the town, and they saved the day, and all this sort of stuff? Because they also, there's some very broad strokes with the plans where the barbarians drug a load of wine, and they've also taken the antidote, which is like a spicy pepper that only they like to eat. And literally every other person in the castle seems to have drunk the wine and been knocked out, except for our three heroes. Yeah, you can get away with these kinds of, very convenient sort of moments if your story is good enough to make me not care about them. But the story wasn't really good enough, so it just felt too convenient to get us there.
Yeah. It felt like too much of an important part of the story. As a very weak part of the story, it's
So not one for me. I didn't get what I was hoping for from it, and unfortunately, this continues the sort of run here of a story ending just at probably its more interesting point. So either we just don't have a satisfying ending to this story, like we've not had a satisfying ending to a couple of the stories so far. And that feels like a shame again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd say that the bad ones in this book are much weaker than the less good ones in Ignorant Armies. And even the ones I disliked most and thought they were a little bit strange, still a lot more to them that was worth discussion and interesting about them. Even the Starboat was as much as it was crazy, there was some really interesting parts to it. Whereas I'm not even sure that two of the stories here that are really that interesting at all. It could be really harsh to them.
Yeah, it's interesting you raised the Starboat, because in the live chat someone did mention that they, based on the name The Hammer of the Stars, it felt like that's the territory we were about to go into again. And I had a similar thought when I started reading it. I was like, oh, is this going to be another weird Slan related adventure? And by the time I ended, I was wishing it was, because that would have been more interesting. Yeah, than what we got was just a bit too plain.
The magic wore off, and Brody turns out he was a Slan who had found a halfling body who had been.
So yeah, I think this one just didn't land. It didn't land again. Pulg's Grand Carnival by Simon Ownsley. A young outcast by the name of Hans is on the way to the big city when he stumbles upon a dying man, the victim of highwaymen. This man gifts the young Hans with his only remaining possession, a magic flute of incredible power. It can control the will of men. On arriving in the city, Hans quickly finds himself in trouble and almost gets himself killed by thieves, until the owner of a carnival, the selfish and irrepressible Pulg, saves his life. Hans joins the carnival, looking after the many unusual creatures within it, but Pulg can't be trusted, and he tries the patience of the people of this city, often falling foul of their political machinations. As things escalate and the carnival stands in danger, Hans must use his most powerful gift, accidentally causing more trouble than he expected. Whilst Pulg may end up arrested and the carnival saved, there are quite a lot of bodies along the way. Pulg's Grand Carnival. This one is the story I was referring to when I said there's a longer story that I was quite frustrated by alongside Cry of the Beast. Because this felt long to me. This did not feel like a quick read.
No, it was long. It was long.
and it didn't feel like it needed to be a long story. And In fact, it felt to me like it was two separate stories somehow merged
Mhm.
into one. I mean, what was your general feel on this?
You're right, it was long. So in terms of listening length, because when you read something, you always put it in perspective, a number of pages. It was double the length of a lot of the others. It was about 2
Really?
hours. Yeah. So, yeah, it was odd. It was very odd, and I think you're right. It was. You feel like it's going to be a story about hands, and then it becomes a story about this sort of carnival of animals, which is, if it was just about a story about that, it might have been a little bit better. But it felt, I don't know, it felt like far too much of the story was based around civic council waste disputes, and it felt like the Chamber of Commerce were about to get involved. Someone was going to contact their MP, and in a Zoom meeting, someone was going to get very, very angry and say, "You have no authority here." But there was an awful lot of sort of low-level local politics in it, but not in a good way. We were arguing about waste disposal to start with. That was sort of the theme for quite a lot of it. We literally can't nowhere to get rid of their, and then it was about, well, we're going to like a rat infestation. It's very kind of local planning laws came into it as well, almost a little bit of we want your land, so we're going to make stuff up so we can build a football, a snot ball stadium.
Yeah.
You could have, this could be a story set in the home counties in a little village somewhere where Tesco's want to expand, and the local NIMBYs are trying to find ways to get rid of a local nightclub or something. It's odd, and I'm not quite sure why that was the kind of focus of it, because you have some interesting characters. Polg's a really interesting character. The nature of what he did and the beasts and things were a really good sort of background to having a short story. I think you could have told a story around this carnival. I'm not quite sure how he's walking around town with a wyvern or wyvern. It feels quite small, but then other times, he's a big dangerous beast, but other times they're walking down the street with him and he flies up and sits on a balcony with him at one point when he's in the pub. It's just, how big is this balcony? How small is this wyvern? The Heidi character is quite interesting as well. I'm not sure why Hans is there. He's there purely to kind of deliver the flute, which is just all a bit weird, really. And just sort of like, is it going to be the pipe? At one point when they were talking about getting rid of the rats, I was thinking this better not be some kind of pastiche on the Pied Piper, and he's going to use the flute and dance off down the street. It was just odd. I didn't sort of dislike it all the way through like a couple of aforementioned ones this evening, because it was unusual enough and at times written okay. It wasn't written terribly, but I'm still not sure that the overall story was the right story to tell with those characters.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It didn't feel like just you have these interesting pieces, but then you've placed them into a story that's not a particularly interesting story. I mean, for me, it just didn't work at all. That's even before you get to the sort of weird structural issues that I felt there were, where you start the story with quite a big hitting opening for a fantasy story. Oh, wow. Here's an old man who has given you a magical item, and that magical item will let you do pretty much anything. You can control the will of anyone. Wow. What an incredible thing to get. I can only assume the rest of this story is going to be you either using it to do stuff and maybe learning a lesson because you do the wrong stuff, or it's going to be about you resisting the temptation to use it all the time, or it's going to be about you learning something about your life and yourself through the use of or having this magical item. Not at all. The magical item with this incredible power goes into the back pocket and doesn't come out again until the very end of the story, where it only exists to cause a minor issue that could have been caused in any number of other ways that would have made way more sense in the same scene. So it's kind of like, well, why have the magic flute in this story at all? When really this should just be a story about a young outcast boy who is taken under the wing of an interesting but unlikable carnival owner, P.T. Barnum, who then exploits him and exploits the animals and exploits everybody else. But then you could argue, well, but he's also given all of these animals a home. He's given this boy a home. So maybe he's doing something good by exploiting him. That's an interesting story. But no, we've then got a load of, like you say, all of the the additional politics of it, which again,
it made me laugh. It amused me.
And in another story,
there were
could have
some
been
good
cool
lines in there, wasn't there? One of the talking about getting rid of the manure, the waste. It was an excrement of evil to be spread on that. No one wants to see excrement of evil to be spread on their vegetables. There's loads of really funny lines like that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was trying to be a comedy. There was lots of bits that were sort of amusing.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of. I think there's a little bit of humor in it, and I think it is trying to have a certain irreverence to it throughout. And listen, I think rat catching is a career in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's a famous part of the Warhammer world. So having that be a sort of part of your narrative is fine. It just needs to be a more fun narrative overall, I would say. So yeah, it didn't come together for me, this one. And I think ultimately, like, the magic flute is only used to stop some guards who are going to arrest Pulg because he's finally gone too far.
Or to make some bullies' trousers fall down as well at the beginning. I mean, don't forget that. That was a really important part of the story.
Sure, yeah. Complete waste of power. And then it's super arbitrary. The flute will last forever, but it needs time to recharge itself, so you can only use it 3 times per year. This is like so arbitrary. Why? Why have you created rules like that? I don't know. Like it could literally have just been you can only use it 3 times, and it would have the same effect in the story.
Would it be more powerful?
Yeah,
it would be much more powerful.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't used to drop trousers, and it was used to get him out of a couple of scrapes, and there was real dilemma about whether he could use it that final time to save this guy who he's not sure he really likes, then it would have been more powerful. But he's not had to save lives twice with it. He's dropped some trousers and tried to save a girl. And
the second time when he does use it on the guards, it interferes with a different magic that we hadn't been told about. That was the reason the Wyvern was friendly, and actually it is a monstrous beast, and it had been bound to Pulg. And the use of the magic flute for some reason turned that spell off. Now, the some reason is that is just convenient for the plot here.
I think it awoke it broke the spell that kind of awoke his senses, because the wyverns.
It was the explanation for it, yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of makes sense. I mean, I think that makes sense more than why the Knights of the White Wolf might turn up to inflict 3 people at a carnival and loads of animals. That seemed a little bit overkill.
Yeah, well, our friends in high places, I think, was the explanation for that one.
Yeah, but there's high places. I thought he meant at the local council. I didn't realize that's like well, if we go back to the original analogies of like the local women's institute complaining about, I don't know, some expansion of Tesco's, but the SAS turn up. It's kind of slightly overkill.
It was
a little bit. I was reading it. I thought when it's mentioned the guard, I thought, yeah, the guard's fine. That makes sense. And it was like, then the Knights of the White Wolf. What were they doing there? That's crazy. And the Rights Guard turned up and helped Kurt Helborg. And
I felt it just didn't work for me. Ultimately, it did not work for me. I think a story about a carnival could be really fun. You know, there's plenty of fun carnivals in the Warhammer world. I think a charlatan who's in charge of that could have been an interesting story. There's lots of interesting stories on the periphery of this, but all of it being sort of the whole story being in service of getting the flute into Pulg's hands so that he can use it to maybe escape from being arrested.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't feel like I needed a whole story to get to that place.
No, and why would you? It's not interesting to get to that place anyway. I'd rather that Hans started at the carnival and the story was about him being given that, and that's his tool to escape, and his choices to, can I go on and do something with my life, or do I save this rather irritable man? Again, you could have definitely had some of those characters in there and used them without, well, not in the way they were.
Yeah, and maybe I'm being ungenerous, and maybe there is something. So Heidi, she talks about the fact that she stays up late to wait for Paul to come home drunk, because then that's a good opportunity for her to hit him on the head and, have a little bit of revenge every day. Maybe there's something in that, and like a broader theme.
In order to do that, she's subjected to his drunken advances and things as well, which is
all sorts of stuff.
very nice. And it's all a bit, well, again, it's very sort of late 80s, early 90s. You that wouldn't be in the story now, I don't think. It wouldn't be forgiven in the same way as it is, because that was very much making a joke out of it. Oh, he's just drunk. We're definitely not in a time now where that would be an acceptable kind of story arc as something to be accepted in that way. But I don't know. I think I liked Heidi as a character, actually. I thought that could have worked, and her and Hans escaping at the end would have been a nice thing, but it felt all backward. Again, another unsatisfactory ending.
I'd say so.
Kind of.
Yeah. Because it also escalated just out of nowhere. Like, Paul suddenly had enough and just whips out some blunderbuss or whatever it is, and he's just sort of taking pot shots and stuff. So there's no sense that Paul himself is a canny operator. He's just, I guess, gotten lucky up to this point. I did feel a bit sorry for the giant rat that he just was happy to kill.
I thought of you when I happened.
Well, because I mean, it's sort of described as just being a nice giant rat, and then in order to get rid of all of the rats and vermin in the whole place, this spell just takes the giant rat out. I don't know why you couldn't have just taken the giant rat somewhere else when you did that spell. I can't imagine there was a time pressure that prevented you from doing that, but I guess that speaks to Paul just not caring. But then the sort of,
I think that was deliberate, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure it was, but you kind of get to so if he doesn't really care about any of the creatures in the carnival or the people in the carnival because of how he treats everyone, what does he care about? And if he doesn't care about anything, surely you would hope that Hans, by the end of the story, would have realized this. And that's what Hans has learned, is not to be taken in by, just because this guy did one nice thing, doesn't mean that you should then be loyal to him despite all of the bad things he does. But he still ends up letting him get away with the flute, and there's kind of a cheeky little blink, he winks back to Hans as he's being dragged off, and Hans is like, oh yeah, he's got my magic flute and he's going to escape. Yeah. And it's
a bit hapless, isn't he? Hans
it's like, what have we learned? What have we learned?
He doesn't go on a journey at all. He almost feels deliberately half-witted up to a point, doesn't he? Obviously he has challenges being an albino, and that sort of brought into it, but also his character's made out to be pretty stupid at times as well. You can understand how a young, impressionable man might be swayed by someone who spends a lot of time talking them up, taking them to the pub, buying them drinks and things, but he doesn't go on a journey of discovering that. He seems to go on this kind of wavy journey of, he's a bit of an ass, isn't he? But then, I don't think he ever even thinks that, though. He kind of a little bit. I think maybe a little bit when he was originally trying to persuade him to join the carnival. He's saying, you just want me to be, to be a freak in your show. And I think he kind of gets it.
Yeah, he does say that. But
when he makes him sit outside the pub anymore to watch the wyvern rather than going in the pub.
He seems to take that, and he's absolutely fine with that, though.
Sort of, but I think he's kind of like, oh, that's not very good, but oh well. And that's what,
and that's my problem.
Doesn't go on the journey where it gets to the point
no
where
journey.
No, I've had enough of his now.
Yeah,
we need to move on.
Yeah, and perhaps if he had, maybe if it was him rather than Heidi who had called the Knights of the White Wolf in, or if it was Heidi who did it, that he makes a choice. You kind of create a situation where he can choose Pulg or Heidi. And then he's got some agency and he's made a choice. Whereas the way it happens in the end of the story is he's just kind of buffeted along. He happened to be stood on that side of the street, and that's how it's played out.
He's had no real impact on it other than bringing this tool. And the way it should have ended would have been him and Heidi leaving, saving the animals, and having the flute and waving at Pole because he gets dragged away for the rest of his life in prison or worse. And that would have been a satisfying ending. As much as you could do to a story that's a little bit weird.
Yeah. So it didn't deliver. Pulg's Grand Carnival is a good name, and it kind of is like, this is going to be a fun setup, and a magic flute. I know there's some pretty good stories about those already, so maybe this is going to be one. And it didn't deliver on the it's bottom of the stories about magic flutes list for me as well. So I don't know. Not a winner, this one, unfortunately.
Nope.
The Way of the Witchfinder by Brian Craig. Florian is a young priest of law, untested in the ways of the world. He goes on a mission of mercy to the town of Orolame, where he hears untold stories of chaos corruption amongst the city's leaders. Though consumed with self-doubt, he steps in to try and stamp out this chaos influence, and finds his faith tested both by temptation and by compassion. The Way of the Witchfinder, the second story in this collection by Brian Craig. What did you think about this? It's quite short, so it's...
Very short, yeah. That surprised me. I thought, this is as far as it's gone, is it? So it felt odd to end with such a short story. Imagine that in the middle somewhere, it wouldn't have been jarring. Maybe just think that was a shorter one. On to the next. Felt like you needed to end with something as powerful as Gotrek and Felix, or ended with Jack Yeovil there. That would have been a stronger ending. But
wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a little bit. I didn't enjoy it an awful lot. It sort of got into that sort of wispy, unrecognizable Warhammer for me, that I know that's probably relevant to its time, or the gods of law. I know that was Warhammer Fantasy role play at its time. It's not something that in my fantasy role playing that we kind of covered much. That's on me rather than the storyteller, so to speak. And the basic premise of the story is okay. You have a sort of a young priest of law who's set on this challenge to prove himself, and he does very, very well to start with, and then ultimately at the end it feels like his final test he fails because he has compassion, which is an interesting take, and you don't know to what level he fails because the story ends. So you don't know the consequences of that failure, whether there is any consequences, because it ends it, and that might be deliberately left to your own imagination. But it was just too short to really kind of draw too much on, I think. But it was short enough that it didn't do too much damage in terms of going off any weird tangents. So it was quite succinct. I mean, obviously, when they put him in this pit in the ground and cover him with this stone, it reminds me of Grima Wormtongue when he whispers in the ear of Theoden and says to his guards, "I told you to take the staff." So from the film, when Gandalf gets in and he's still got his walking stick, and because of he's got his power. Well, why didn't they take the staff off him before they shoved him in that hole? Because he uses the staff and the power to kind of get out of this thing. So they just took that staff off him, he'd still be in that hole probably, wouldn't they? It seems a little bit of straightforward. Just let the wizard in, leave him with all his magical items, and then wonder where he gets out. But I haven't got an awful lot more thoughts on that. It's interesting that the plays around the god of law and Solkan actually having a bit of a voice in the story rather than just being something that's talked about as people worshipping that god. So that was interesting. But it's not got any depth to it to really explore that an awful lot more, I feel.
Yeah, I think I agree. I don't think this was necessarily the strongest ending story. I mean, I think if no Gold in the Grey Mountains had ended this collection, then we'd be starting and ending on real strong stuff.
Yeah.
But for what it was, I actually didn't mind this story. I thought this is probably the better of the Brian Craig stories in here. It is brief, but there's something interesting in this version of the Gods of Law, I think, in a way that's probably more interesting than we saw them explored in Zaragoza. I quite like this, the Gods of Law being a very mirrored image of the Chaos Gods, where they are just, obviously the Chaos Gods are just, anything kind of goes. They have their sort of, they have their spheres of influence or their interests or what have you, but it is a wild and wonderful kind of place in worshiping those Chaos Gods. Whereas the Gods of Law are totally unyielding. If you have faith in these guys, in order for them to give you whatever gifts they might give you and sort of do, whatever, reward your faith in them, you have to be completely in line with their expectations and how you should worship them and how you should behave. And that can be a bad thing, even though law seems like it would be a good thing, and they're opposite of chaos, and chaos are bad, right? So they must be good. Well, no, actually, compassion is not, like, that's frowned upon by the Gods of Law because it goes against their structured expectations of what you should be doing. So having compassion for someone and forgiveness for someone who's done something bad is just as bad and just as wrong to the Gods of Law as succumbing to temptation and being seduced by chaos. There's no difference. The Gods of Law, there's no gray. They are black and white as you can possibly get. And actually, that's a really bad thing. So I think the Gods of Law could have been a very interesting faction to see in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I think if you think about this as this opposite of chaos, but just as evil in a different way, where they are super, super ordered, and there is a very clear, it's not like chaos where you've got all these weird mutations and everything's like a gross and strange. It's almost order to a level of like fractal abstraction. So it would drive you mad, but it's extremely ordered in some weird way. I can't really even imagine it or verbalize what I'm trying to say, but I think I know where you're going. There's something theoretically very cool about that. That if there is a world where Brian Craig, and actually on the Oldhammer Fiction podcast, Lewis talks about this as well. I think it's a great point. There's a world where Brian Craig's view of the Warhammer world is the one that is progressed through all of the fiction and through all of the games, and actually Estalia and Bretonia as the sort of medieval version of France and the Gods of Law become the cornerstones of Warhammer lore with a L-O-I-E. and you just end up with a Warhammer world that's totally unrecognizable to us, but is totally leaning into all of the stuff Brian Craig was interested in. And then we'd be looking back at him and saying, this is the guy who's writing the foundational fiction for all of this cool stuff. Unfortunately for him, every subsequent writer said, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
let's put all that to one side, and we're going to go in a completely different direction.
Well, a lot of that other stuff was already in existence. He just
the things he chose to focus on for whatever reason just ultimately kind of ended up being the stuff that was ousted from the setting. Really, still there, but just not important to the setting. But yeah, I think there is something. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It inspired in me those thoughts of what would a Warhammer Fantasy Battle army look like that worshipped Solkan. And I think that could be very, very cool. Someone should do that project as an army, because I think that would be fascinating to imagine.
I wonder if there's a faction in War Machine, Menoth, which are kind of religious zealots that are kind of ultra good, but maybe they're not so, because they're so zealous in their beliefs and things. And I wonder whether, and this is why this is kind of dangerous to talk about in some ways, because you want to go down to avenues we don't really want to cover on a podcast. But I do feel that kind of ultra law idea of ultra goodness, but so unyielding in its views, could lead you towards, that kind of how good, almost like you said, good becomes almost bad because of its inability to show any compassion. And
I think so. Yeah,
be interesting, but you'd
it
end up
would
with
be
some kind of almost fascist state, couldn't you? Because it was so prescriptive and of the way you should be, and you're not allowed to kind of because it feels like a lot of with Cyrene that yes, she's clearly fallen to chaos gods, but it also feels like that we're at the point of it's not just pure evil. There's a lot of enjoyment there, and it's almost like Lore is going, stop having fun. You're not allowed to have fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's maybe it's good that they didn't kind of go down that road for the background, because it would have been a little bit too.
I don't know. I just and this is
maybe
not in the text at all, but just whilst I'm here, I'm imagining what would the equivalent of chaos mutations be for Lore, gods of Lore.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and so an example, and this might be a very basic version of this, but imagine if like the mutations were almost like your body became like geometric, and like because all of the sort of the fleshiness of a human is totally flawed and totally the organic.
This is where
stuff
it gets dangerous, because you start looking at purity and
but
then it becomes problematic. I think.
Oh, absolutely, it's problem. But then these are not good guys. So the gods of Lore are not good guys. But so imagine like your hand, which is like weird and has all of these odd shapes and does all of these odd things, actually then becomes just like a block, a cube. The perfect shape. And like that is the mutation that you get from the gods of Lore, is that your hands become just like granite blocks and things like that. Or you might have, I'm imagining in the I think it's Snow White and the Huntsman, where there is a sort of magical army that's created by the evil queen, who are almost made out of glass. So when they get struck, they just shatter into glass. And then, these kinds of weird shapes and sort of materials. I think there's something interesting, but like I say, that's not in this story at all.
I think he works better in Warhammer 40,000, where perceived purity is something that you see in Mechanicum and Mechanicus, when they will get rid of the superfluous bits, they will improve themselves, and there's no there's no need for that humanity. We just want to be the best. So rather than purity, it becomes what they believe is the right.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
In many ways, that's just as horrible.
Yeah.
And as the chaos side of things, because there's still mutilation there. But interesting, but harder in a fantasy setting.
Yeah, and none of this is in this story, but I was just moved to, because we have here a story that I thought was interesting and was concerned with the gods of Lore. It kind of sparked some interesting thoughts. And I think that's what a good fantasy story should be. It should be like helping you imagine this world and explore a different aspect of it. So I think it worked in that respect. Also, when he was trapped in that cell and he was just chanting this prayer for 3 days, and it sort of then he was able to just walk through materials, through objects, through space, and just walk up to the tower. That really reminded me of like Avatar: The Last Airbender or Korra. And there was, these sort of elemental powers where you could just fold earth around you and just walk straight through a mountain or a building. And that was a cool visual to me. I was imagining that
stuff.
They should have taken the stuff off him. Yeah.
It was good. It was good. I suppose another point we're talking about the purity of the power. Maybe that's just Solkan's view of how priests of Lore should be. Maybe not how all followers of Lore would be. So
sure, if these are the paragons,
harsh lesson. And that's it. So maybe that every follower of Lore shouldn't be uncompassionate at that moment.
Well, and then there's sort of like the curse, or the because of his failure, is that the reason that the sea is going to come and claim the city back? So the city's built on the sands, on the beaches.
I feel like that was always going to happen anyway.
Well, yeah, and then that's kind of an interesting kind of point as well, isn't it? I mean, this is people attribute to the gods these devastating events, and you could say, well, if he prayed harder, not fallen to the temptation of pity, maybe Solkan would have spared the city.
I mean, these stories are familiar from a certain other book that's quite prevalent in the real world, and again, maybe that's why it's safer to stay away from them, because there's a lot more familiarity with that and the way that
Sure, and yeah, and it was an interesting one. I mean, what the other thing that sprang to mind was Mont Saint Michel as the city on the sea, like actually in the sea, basically on the beach.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a nice visual. It feels like maybe that's what inspired it.
Is it Mont Saint Michel, do you think?
Sorry, yeah.
No, I know. I mean, is it the real? I wonder if that's where the idea.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
yeah.
Did it? You know, just like a towering city built onto a beach, and the sea will always claim it back. That kind of is totally where my mind went at the start of the story.
I imagine so. I mean, I've been there this summer.
Sure, yeah,
and it's a wonderful place, and yet it does feel like you're walking around a Bretonian city, and I can see how that would be a lovely setting for this. So yeah, that gives you a really good idea. So
yeah,
not just being reclaimed by the sea yet, luckily.
That's because the prayers to Solcan.
Yes, absolutely. They're all playing to Solcan in there. That's why.
There was an odd thing in this story, though, where it didn't work for me. And that was that Florian, who is sort of positioned as a bit of a naive young priest. So this is his first journey out on a mission.
Yeah.
And he sits down in the center of the sort of town square, and he's hearing for several days all of these tales. And it's positioned as if he's hearing gossip. And it's very much the sort of vibe I got from the story was that you'd be a bit naive and foolish to believe everything you heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
The truth is amplified into something that's more
exactly,
used a rumor. So maybe think, and that sort of kind of brings you back to, well, how bad is Cyrene? Is she? How bad is the lot of all the people?
Sure.
That
and then
he
acts
brings you back to that
gossip.
interplay of what's good and bad about the two gods at the end, with the showing lack of compassion. Who is the real bad guy at the end? So
yeah, we don't get enough of that, though, I think, because Florian then acts on all of this information he's been given, which we are led as readers, we're led to believe that it's probably not all true. But when he confronts Cyrene, it is all true. So he was right to confront. Yeah, it was the right thing to confront her. She is evil. She is in league with chaos. Maybe you could argue that then the compassion thing sort of tips the balance back into, you know, not everything's black and white. But I don't know. It just didn't. The fact that his faith is very much about law and things being black and white, true and false, binary states, and yet the way he comes about the information is the opposite of that.
Yeah,
didn't feel like it quite made sense to me.
Probably needed more time to explore that.
A little bit, yeah. But yeah, overall, it prompted some very interesting thoughts in my head. It was certainly not my favorite of the stories, but because it was so short, it was just this little tiny exploration of this sort of corner of the world that we won't see too much more of in time. Obviously we will, because we've got Brian Craig stories to come. But in the wider Warhammer world, this is just something that's of an older era.
Yes, yeah. It was nice. I think it was lovely in the middle of the book as a little
I agree
interlude.
So where did you feel that this collection of stories, so Wolf Riders as a book, is this as good as Ignorant Armies? Is it better? It's hard to compare it to the novels, but where were you sort of placing this? Is a fourth book we've read from GW Books?
It's at bottom out of the four.
Right.
As much as it's got two very good stories in, two very, very good stories in, I think the rest, there's a significant amount that are disappointing rather than just kind of interesting. Well, I probably wouldn't read it again, but I'm glad I read it. Some of these, the first time I didn't enjoy things, rather than I didn't enjoy parts of a story, or that was a bit strange. There were stories here that I genuinely just didn't enjoy at all, and they had me chuckling, but at stages. But Paul's Grand Carnival was amusing, but it wasn't great. But Hammer of the Stars just wasn't good, and Cry of the Beast really wasn't good. I'm not a huge fan of the Phantom movie as well. It was okay at times, but Yeah. There's a couple of ones that I thought it lost a lot of pace. It lost a lot of momentum earlier on.
Mm.
And it kind of detracts from the couple of the better. You've forgotten, by the time you get to the end, it's very easy to forget how strong that it started. And I think it needed to start strong with Bill King. I think it's probably a reason why he's there at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
It's like a bottom of the table football team that's got two good players in that just about keep it in games and give you some hope that they can win. But there's a lot of weakness in there.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I do think the highs were pretty high. So the two stories, I think Wolf Riders itself and No Gold in the Grey Mountains were both great. I really enjoyed them. No Gold in the Grey Mountains, I think, was super strong for me. I had a great time with that. And then the Tylean Rat, I also really, really liked. Despite my qualms about its ending, it was just a great read for me. Mm-hmm. And then Phantom of Remy, I thought was a fun story to read, if not to then sort of reflect on afterwards.
Yeah.
Same with The Way of the Witchfinder, really. That sort of falls into that camp. And then, yeah, we've got then 3 stories that just didn't tick any boxes for me, really. So yeah, it's I would agree it's probably the weakest as a book of the 4 books that we've read, but some of the stories in here are going to stay with me, and I will be revisiting, and I am looking forward to more from those authors and characters.
Yeah.
Would you give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, do you think?
Oh, it's really difficult, because I was just thinking as you were talking then a bit about what you were saying about some of the stories would stay with you. And I'm trying to think about, would those stories stay with me? How have we not been doing this process? I can confidently say that they wouldn't have had a second read stroke listen. So maybe they wouldn't. They would have been kind of pushed aside and forgotten relatively quickly. So if I'm being honest with that sense, then you remove the 2 really strong stories and it would be a thumbs down. It is whether I can kind of do that because of them.
You can't. This is the gods of lore. You need a binary on this one, up or down.
Well, as my favorite story there appears in another book, it's saved. So I'm going to say a thumbs down.
Ooh, first thumbs down we've got. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
For me, I'm going to go thumbs up still, because the stories I liked, I really liked. I thought they were great. And even some of the stories that were mixed for me, I think were still really worthwhile. So yeah, I think frustrations aside, I still really enjoyed reading the collection. And I've got questions about, why were there not more stories about dwarves? Why are there not more stories about elves? More stories about halflings? At least we get a couple in this. Why so many stories about the same kinds of characters? Whether that's because that was the brief, write a story about a teenage boy in the Empire or Bretonia. Maybe that's what they were told to do. But I think for all of the missed opportunities, there's still stuff in here that I enjoyed, and that's why I'm giving it the thumbs up.
Yeah, it's definitely still bits I enjoyed. That's undeniable. But the danger is everything will just have a thumbs up, because there will be little bits I enjoyed. And if I'm really, as I said, if I'm trying to step back from the process and really enjoying having these conversations and having a lot of fun with it, especially some of the bad ones in some ways, if it brought a lot of enjoyment, but more to do with the discussion afterwards than the reading the story. If I was just reading it as a book alone, I would have got to the end and thought, well, I only liked a couple of those stories. One of them I've read before because it's part of a long series I love. And that leaves you one very, very good but quite short story by Kim Newman.
Yeah, it's fair.
The rest I could very much live without, and that's why it would be a thumbs down.
Well, that's where I guess we'll end it for now on Wolf Riders. We've got a hiatus in December, so we're not going to be doing any of the GW book clubs in December, but we will be returning in January with Conrad. So that's the start of a new trilogy. So that's something that I'm quite looking forward to. I've never read Conrad, so I'm keen to see how that plays out. When we do get back into it, you can join me on my Patreon live stream if people are interested in that, where we actually get together and talk about it at length. I think our live stream session for Wolf Riders was about 3 hours in the end, because we had so much stuff to go through and talking about all the different aspects of it. So we'll be doing that again for Conrad in the middle of Jan. And then we will be back, Stu, on the YouTube channel with the next episode of the GW Books Club. In the meantime, where can people find you?
Miniature Realms, YouTube first, and then you can catch me on all the major social medias as well, at Miniature Realms.
Fantastic. I'll put links in the description to that as well. And you've just launched a Discord as well, haven't you?
I have, yes. Just finally, I just hit 10,000 subscribers on the channel, so I used it as an excuse to launch a Discord and a Patreon as well now as well. So if you are thinking of looking at the channel, go and have a look at those as well.
Fantastic. I'll put the links to those. I've also got a Patreon and a Discord as well, so you can join that. Come and join us on both. Lots of great conversation.
Give us both all the money.
But until next time, thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.